Good morning. I thought I'd try something a little different. Given how fast things are moving, there is a greater need to compress information. And after all, intelligence is compression. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the highlights to have a visual and frame all these things towards a collective goal, towards four things, providing an update on the initial launch of Gemini 1, which is Google's answer to OpenAI GPT-4 and Microsoft, a great visual teaching tool and explaining tool as number two, three being a view of where academia still is on AI ethics and seeing where I think the trend is going to go. And then last view of how one way to download the main Windows Copilot system, same system is being currently used at the Mayo Clinic, onto a Windows 10 computer. So first things first, Google Bard is now powered by Gemini 1, which is the with Gemini Pro specifically. So Gemini being the foundation model is what they have put out that is on par, if not better, in certain instances than GPT-4. Now, one big difference I've noticed initially is that Bard and Gemini, at least through this interface, will not interpret radiographs like X-rays, while GPT-4 does, at least currently. To me, what I did see as well, though, is that there is a use where it understands that there are images being put, such as this here. So some blood cells from a microscope slide. And what we find is that it will end up looking through the image. And while you notice that it does end up talking about what the red blood cells are, it does not end up necessarily going into a full report like you would see uh, a clinician use. Consideration here, of course, being that as now the law has it where clinicians' notes are viewable by all patients to include lab results, I can definitely see this adding to some friction with clinicians and patients who are using this platform, particularly particularly patients, and posing questions, good questions from a place of wanting to understand, but then again, the intellectual dysphoria that may be occurring as some clinicians feel outpaced or that they now have to adopt a new thing, being AI specifically. So if nothing else, having a view on or a policy to clinicians on within the different hospital systems of the fact that this is occurring and what its benefits are, what its limitations are, and then really what the way that the clinic is going to speak with a unified voice to clinicians. Seeing that, again, right here, a non-labeled, non-identifying radiograph specifically being seen as not only not processed, not communicated on, but specifically being removed immediately. So secondly is this great visual explaining giving a view of how a large language model really thinks or how it processes. Don't want to anthropomorphize things. So the way I would suggest to go through this is starting from top to bottom, left to right, and this being effectively a digital book. And so with C, we look at, for the sake of just transparency and simplicity, which is important, more important, given how complex all these things are, is that we will have words that are fed, or typed, or entered into an interface like ChatGPT. Those words then become tokenized. So they're put into tokens. And the nice thing is that this goes through that entire process. And so starting from up here, the introduction, so we start with there, and then we'll note, right, that it starts saying, take the sequence of letters, and then sort them. You press spacebar, and then it has a view exactly step by step, right? And then so each of those letters then becomes a token that then ends up being brought through and processed as a signed number in the same way that, think of a physical location on a map can be translated into GPS location, latitude and longitude. Those are two different descriptors, two different patterns of describing the same thing, because ultimately computers, classical computers, operate on ones and zeros. All programming language is effectively a way to communicate to computers at speed without having to learn how to speak in ones and zeros, because ain't nobody got time for that. And so again, what we see is that all that data is put in with the tokens and it's fed in to the model. And then where it starts to get, and this is beyond the scope, I would argue, for this, and ultimately it becomes what's called an embedding, where it gets embedded into this structure. And now we see is there's, for like data, big data, we see that we're called, they become vectors. So words become embeddings, they get translated into vectors, which turns into a whole spaghetti stream of data after the fact, and a database, which is what the new paradigm that I talked about of retrieval augmented generation. So a model going to a trusted source of information, grabbing from that. Vectors, after they're turned into data, become that database. So in order for words to be able to make sense to a model, it's this tokenization process into the numbers. They could turn into embedding, they could turn into vectors that allow for it to then be able to be trained on that. The point with this is not to learn all that or to have the math or to become experts in this. The point is to be able to see that this is a process, this is really just math versus magic, and then to understand, therefore, what the pitfalls are, and to be able to help decision makers ask the right questions of having somebody able to explain this technology or how their process is in a very demonstrable way versus a lot of the current social engineering that's occurring of just throwing a bunch of words out and people feeling they have no real choice given how powerful these things are. So summate for this, it's going from the top left. If you just click any of these, they'll all be the same, but you just start up by clicking introduction here, and then you scroll down and you click space, and it will start back again. So wherever the chapter is that you want to end up looking. And this is all open source, and while I'm sure there are someone will find issues or it doesn't cover everything, it does do the best job I've currently seen of explaining really what happens from beginning to end with the large language models, and to help people feel more empowered and less feeling again like this is magic, because it is not that. Third, being this large language, this recent, I say somewhat recent, but this paper from the Lancet about the ethics of large language models. So less recent, but more recent to me, and speaking again back to that, what we're starting to see is more of the conversation around ethics within AI. And the topic itself is difficult because because it's very multifactorial in terms of this is not the trolley problem of right there. It's not just actually in some ways it is right. There's no real one school of thought that can apply to this. There is no fully right answer. The two themes that are being more prominent in the deep tech space is this push on the one hand of make everything open source, which does not mean free, some people seem to think. It just means that you make it available and that more often than not, the entirety of the code is made available. So, which is what Meta initially did when they leaked their large language model, Meta AI or Llama models, is that they made it available. And well, what occurred? The tech community did what it typically does, is it saw something and they said, I can make this better, or oh, I know I can do this, because they felt that they didn't know when they were going to get another chance, and that in some ways more so the hacker community sees these opportunities and takes them. But also, again, everybody who is, in the end, Meta is going to win because they're not trying to just take, right? It's a collaboration at this point. And most programmers, software engineers, have a practice of putting all of their code in the same way that clinicians and medical students put their accomplishments onto PubMed and really write them on their CVs and make them available, or Instagram. In either fashion, they're putting their information out there in the hope of getting a job or hope of being seen and helping their professional career. So the tech companies have just stopped competing with that and started to make that their ecosystem. And Microsoft owns GitHub. So all that code, they already got it. So the point for me in getting this is that there are going to be a lot of unproductive conversations pontificating on ChatGPT and whether or not people are using it, when again there are dozens of models that are enterprise grade, so at the level of GPT-4, and hundreds of thousands of models that are at a level somewhat below that, but that is still very big. And now that Gemini is here and has multimodality, being text to speech, speech to text, image to video, and right, all the different transmissions with that, it speaks to now a further acceleration, which is going to cause a lot more negative emotion and the concern that people will make certain policy decisions in the name of what they feel is ethical at the time, rather than making it for the long term. But again, not something to me to concern on, or even to prevent to these conversations, or it's just to acknowledge that this is coming and to be thoughtful and mindful of where people are at, given the increasing stress, as well as having the prudence to, again, hold more to the deep values and not wanting to be first, but to rather make best and prudent service, and knowing when rather not to react based off of understanding the technology. Third being the Windows Copilot and Microsoft 10. So most people previously, Windows 10 or Windows 11, excuse me, was the only system that offered the Windows Copilot. Now, so for me, I've had Windows Copilot for some time. This is the same article that I spoke on with the Mayo Clinic using it. And the nice thing is that when you hear Copilot, that is, think GPT-4. So, right, and with this, what we see is, right, we'll see whether or not this actually does end up going about the same. But because things are always updating. But when you see Copilot with Microsoft, you should be thinking GPT-4, at least. If not GPT-4 with Vision. Ah, perfect. So, and in contrast to Google, Gemini, that now powers Bard, that saw that image of the X-ray and said, nope, not even going to mess with that. Copilot, which is Microsoft and OpenAI, right? So OpenAI's GPT-4 put into a user interface uh, that is accessible on my Windows machine anytime I want. That also makes use of Bing for the internet. Not only does it end up taking that image in, it also then gives a view of this is an X-ray, talking about what the possible issues are. And again, I want to make clear that all I did was upload this image and I may put in the text prompt, explain this image. And then it immediately knew with no other training data, this is a proprietary model from Microsoft, that this, what it was, that it was an X-ray. And yes, are there clinicians that can do better than this? Dozens, hundreds, thousands even. But really the point is that there are how many more patients are there that feel frustrated with their clinical teams or do not have the funds to be able to go to the hospital themselves or want a second opinion. They're going to go to this and then they're going to come equipped to their clinicians with all the language that typically is only in medical textbooks or in clinical practice guidelines or in, and right, and now it looks to search for these things or optimize based on what Bing has put in is where this information exists in, right? And so it speaks to the great power of these systems, but also the subtleties of, it's not about AI becoming Skynet. It's about where do these different sources, who decides what is truth and what is not truth? And again, not from a malfeasant place, but rather just from a, what does that process look like? Because when certain organizations get highlighted, then others are not seen. And really it's just, okay, where's that information? What's the adjudicating factor for that? And the Cleveland Clinic, that's a pretty decent place to look to in terms of that, but it's not pulling up random controlled trials from PubMed. It's not pulling up uh, WebMD, thank goodness. But it's just more of looking to understand for just the sake of seeing where the decision-making processes are of why did it choose these things to go to? And because at the end of the day, no matter what, these companies are making these organizations, these technologies, they want to continue to exist. So they have a not only a financial incentive, but in a lot of ways a fiduciary responsibility to their investors, and they also just would like to avoid a bunch of lawsuits. So they are incentivized primarily to curate information, but make it so that there's value to it. And so with that, that covers the main things to get at. I think the ask is really to consider where this technology is existing within the different spheres that we're all in, right? Because again, even Bing, Chat, see Enterprise, that is Copilot as well. This being on just Internet Explorer now. if folks end up having the privileges given by their administrators. And so it's a conversation to be had of it's not who is using AI, it's how many AI systems are people using. And it's also understanding that fairly most businesses and investors will ask, well, what do you do that Microsoft, Google do not do? And to me, the main point being it's the clinical leaders in the loop, as well as experience of, well, the intelligence community having that red teaming, blue team, so offense and defense mindset that is necessitated at this point. We're seeing in the deep tech cybersecurity space as more ransomware attacks are increasing, and medicine and education are the two most vulnerable, as well as having a actual placement within the medical education system that spans from the trainee to the established attending to really bridge those gaps as we're seeing more people jumping into the mentorship business model, but doing so without paying as much attention to all the big shifts that are occurring.